Hello, everybody. We are live at Trusty's Vintage Deep Dive. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. As hopefully you figured out or saw through some of our promotions, Trusty's Deep Dive tonight is with Katie from Vintage and Vinyl, and we're going to be covering vintage vinyl. So appreciate everyone who has signed on for this evening. Katie and I were just talking before we went live. Did not have a chance to see what we are actually competing against, but that's quite all right. There's a broad range of things for people to watch on YouTube. And for those of you who came over to watch this, really appreciate you being here. So appreciate, let's see, we got Laura Bemos coming in. She's a veteran of the Trusty's Vintage Deep Dive. She did her deep dive on dominoes. Welcome, Little Vintage Me 64. Oh, we got Scott.
Hi, Scott.
Hey, Scott has come to join us. We got Joni from Vintagerous and Tia Fane. Oh, we got Tia Fane coming on here. Usually I only see your name on George's sales so, or George's premiere. So great to have you here. Melody's come on here.
Hi, Melody.
And let's see, Mama J has joined us.
Hello, Mama.
Got a lot of familiar names coming into the chat this evening. Got Elderly Poodle.
Hi, Poodle.
So great to have you back with us. Karen Radford's joining us.
Hello, Karen.
See, I always feel guilty if I miss somebody, particularly a vintage or a Trusty Deep Dive veteran. But oh, we got Jamie from Mid-Century Wasted. She is in the lineup to do a vintage deep dive, and I will let Jamie decide whether she's going to announce what her deep dive is on. But I will just say I'm super excited to have part of it. So watch the chat to see if Jamie decides to. We haven't picked a date yet, but she will definitely be an upcoming vintage deep dive. Blake, welcome. Thanks for joining us. That's a name I don't recognize, so if you're new here, welcome. Record Crate, I know that. Thanks for joining. I know Katie was on your show a couple weeks ago.
It was great. Hi, Adam. So good to see you tonight.
Thanks for joining us, Adam. And so tonight, hopefully we've got some people who might know a little bit about vintage vinyl, LPs, albums, records. See, I don't even know the terms I'm supposed to use, so that's why I need to do this deep dive with Katie. So if you haven't joined a deep dive in the past, oh wait, Blake Dorman, that's a Jamie Dorman. So we've got both. And I vaguely remember watching one of Jamie's videos that Blake does. Blake, do you collect LPs, don't you? I want to say you did a Facebook Marketplace haul or something where you were trying to get a collection. Was it Beethoven? Something that you had to drive through the sleet in Oregon. See, I remember really weird things, but I don't remember the stuff I'm supposed to remember. So anyway, thank you for joining us, Blake. Yes, so you definitely have anyone who's not joined a deep dive in the past. These are live, as obviously we're watching the chat. The idea behind this is, as Katie's covering her vintage vinyl, you will be able to ask questions, and I encourage you to do so. So if you, again, if you're new, haven't been here before, just make sure when you're in YouTube, you would need to be on your phone. You'll need to be doing this in the app, not on your browser, because that gives you access to the live chat. And so as long as you're in the live chat, you can ask questions. So, okay, and Jamie did come clean. She is going to do a deep dive on vintage paint by numbers.
Oh, that's going to be so fun.
Yeah, so we're going to have a lot of fun with that one. I'm already booked solid through the end of the year. I'm having problems confirming one of them, so I might be shifting some things around. But most likely, she is going to be in January or February. So, I guess it's good that I've got that much interest that far in advance. And, if Scott from Old Curiosity Shop ever wants to do something on glass, I'd be more than happy to have him.
Oh, that would be phenomenal.
So, I mean, I'd have to, George wants to do one on Treasure Craft, and I feel so bad because I have to push him into 2021. So, even the big boys sometimes get pushed back. But anyway, we got another veteran, Mossstone Story. Kelly came in for she did a Little Golden Books deep dive, and that actually turned out to be one of the most popular deep dives I've did. And that information, I use it all the time. I started carrying children's books in my booth, and definitely use a lot of what she shared. Still on the lookout for a little golden book with a dust jacket. I've yet to see one of those in the wild. But tonight we are here for Katie. So Katie is from Vintage and Vinyl. If you are not already following her on Instagram and on YouTube, please do so. Her Instagram is vintage_and_vinyl. I'll try and get that set up as a banner while we're talking. And her YouTube channel is Vintage and Vinyl. Once this posts, I'll make sure there's a link in there. There might be one in the comments already, but I'll just make sure there's a link to that. So you can, sometimes it's hard to find it. So definitely watch for the link if you haven't subscribed to her already. So tonight's deep dive is going to be on Vintage Vinyl. So who's a better person to ask than Katie from Vintage and Vinyl? So we'll just start off with Katie. We're going to let her introduce herself a little bit and then kick off the first question is, why vintage vinyl? How'd she get started collecting it? So here we go with Katie.
Hey guys, so I am Katie from Vintage and Vinyl, as Patrick just mentioned. It's so great to see all of you in the chat tonight. And I'll go ahead and answer Patrick's question on how I got into vintage vinyl. So there's kind of an interesting history here about myself and vinyl. Actually, I grew up in the eras of CDs and, of course, streaming music, LimeWire, and all that kind of stuff from back in the day. But I love 50s music. And the first time that I heard it was in my grandparents' car. My dad's parents had 50s on 5. We were driving to my dad's house at Christmas time, and they played 50s on 5. And I remember really liking that music. It was just something different. And then flash forward years later, I got a chance to see Jersey Boys in London, and I fell in love with the wonderful world of Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And if you know anything about that musical, they also have other 50s songs that the Four Seasons backed up from that time period. And I really just couldn't get enough of it. And so I started the journey as a record collector, collecting vinyl. And I started with Frankie Valli. So I went to my first record store in St. Louis, where I've got some family, Vintage Vinyl, the home of Chuck Berry. And I spent hours in there having so much fun getting vinyl. And the first record I got was Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons Greatest Hits. And I got a record player for Christmas, and I've been into vinyl ever since, because once you get into vinyl, you never go back, because there is something about that warm, wonderful sound. Vinyl is very, very different than CDs. It's not compressed music. Digital music is compressed, and it doesn't sound like the artist intended. It's not warm. It's not full. It's not really coming to life that a vinyl has. Vinyl has that life, and it's so amazing. Compressed music's kind of like taking an orchestra that's sitting in front of you and taking half of the orchestra away and cramming it all together, and you're not really getting to hear everything. And a good vinyl record will make you feel like you are sitting live with the artist right in your own living room. So it's amazing what vinyl can do. And it comes in a variety of colors, shapes, sizes, and formats. So I can't wait to share all of this with you tonight.
One of the things that you mentioned, and I know we're going to go backwards a little bit, but I'm curious, because we do cover a little bit of what we're going to talk about, but we don't go into details. So it's just a little series of rabbit holes we go down. So you had mentioned that Frankie Valli was the first album that you had received, and that you got a record player for Christmas. Now, we do not need to go into the depth of how old you are or how old you were when you did that, but I'm curious what kind of record player you got. Was it a portable turntable? Was it part of a stereo system? What, at point of your childhood, what was the listening device of choice at that point? Which was probably before it became, I don't know, maybe there was a lot of variety at that point too. And then how did that compare with the progress of the same type of turntable from earlier? And then what's available today? I know that vinyl's kind of coming back, but I don't know if the turntables are any different.
So vinyl is coming back. It's making a big comeback, and everyone is really into vinyl right now. Now, I started out with a CD player, and then I got a vinyl record player, but I actually didn't know much about record players at the time. I thought you just needed one to essentially play vinyl. But boy, was I was wrong. I mean, I learned so much since my first suitcase style player. Yes, I had a Crosley when I started out listening to vinyl, which is totally fine. That's how a lot of people get into music, and it really has helped boost the vinyl world and get more people into vinyl because they're so expensive. But I started learning more about record players and what a good record player has and how to really curate your sound. That's the wonderful thing about vinyl, is you can continue to curate your sound by adding different pieces of equipment and getting different things. And every little thing you do, from the turntable mat to the stylus, really does impact your sound. And nowadays there are so many different record players, ranging from $100 all the way to $50,000, and you can choose which one you want and what's right for you. Of course, way back in the 1800s, they had the gramophone, and those are not really around anymore. I mean, you can buy them at antique stores, but they're not really a method of playing modern vinyl now. They play older vinyl, like the 78 shellac discs, and then you have even earlier cylindrical records where you need a special machine to play those, or even the Edison diamond discs. So record players have really come a long way, and 70s turntables really are something to look at. A lot of people now that are into vinyl are going back and buying these 70s turntables, especially like the Techniques was really revolutionary for its time in the 70s. And people really love buying this vintage audio equipment, especially audio equipment that has, like, say, vacuum tubes in it, where you're really hearing that warm sound. So it's amazing. You just have to do some research on record players. And I've got a great video on that on my channel. So if you're wanting to get started in the vinyl, don't be scared about getting a turntable. There's a lot of great information, and I'm here to help you with that.
The Techniques turntable, I never would have come up with that, but the minute you said that word, that is what I had in the 70s. So I do actually remember that.
Oh, that's a great player.
Yeah, so that's, but since we're covering this from a vintage reselling or from a vintage perspective, and you mentioned and you showcased those little cylinders, one of the questions that I had, and then we'll kind of get into maybe the progress of the actual flat discs that we're more familiar with, but those little cylinders, some people who watch my channel know that I do theater on the side, or I've done theater on the side. And I directed a show one time called Camping with Henry and Tom. And it was about one of the characters, Tom Edison. And Thomas Edison, one of the things it referenced was those little circular discs, but in a portable playing device. So it still had that big conical, like the big phonograph thing, but it was actually portable. So at what point, like what in the general time frames, where were those little circular discs, where were they used, or when were they used, and how did that kind of progress or lead to the kind of like the Victrola is probably what most of us know, those little vertical cabinets that have that turntable with that big cone thing on the outside.
So records actually go all the way back to 1877 with Thomas A. Edison's invention of the phonograph. Now, he invented this as a voice recorder, a voice writer, as he called it. He really didn't have the big picture of it being for music, but other inventors actually saw the bigger picture and would later on improve upon his idea. Now, he actually really didn't like music. Believe it or not, he actually called jazz as something for the nuts, and that if you listen to ragtime, he thought it was completely miserable. He didn't like it at all. So he kind of stuck with the idea of this being a voice recorder machine. But these records came out in 1877 with the phonograph invention, but really they weren't wax. The first record Thomas A. Edison used to try to test his invention was basically a cardboard tube with a glorified cylindrical piece of foil. So basically just like glorified tinfoil on a piece of cardboard. And the first song that they tried to record and play back was Mary Had a Little Lamb. They did get through it, but you can imagine how a record with tinfoil and cardboard sounded. Not good at all. So there are other people that did improve upon the invention, which brings records to what we know now. And Alexander Graham Bell was credited with actually creating the cylindrical record. And this is a wax cylinder that we would have seen on those early style players. And this is a first record. This one's from 1901, but there are other companies that made these. This one's made by Edison Gold Mold Records. He did have a phonograph company, even though he hated music, because he had investors that kind of talked him into that. But he wasn't a very good marketer. And so these sort of failed. But it wasn't really until German-American inventor Emil Berlinger built a working gramophone, and he patented it in 1887 and really helped to get records off the ground, because then that sparked the invention of the Victrola, or the Victor Talking Machine Company, in 1895. That's the first record player that is really mass marketed and on the market for people to use. So that's really, really neat.
So before Berlinger came along and did patented the gramophone, were they all smaller, like to the point where they were intended to be portable, or were they large devices like pieces of furniture, like the Victrola eventually, like what that basically that we're familiar with?
Most of them were all small, and they even had colored records way back when. And the idea that they were small was Edison actually took his invention around to different places trying to show people what it could do. So he would take it to various halls and so forth. And there was a lot of maintenance needed, of course, on those early machines, as well as the record, because at that point, before you get to Alexander Graham Bell inventing this wax cylinder, and this one is blue, guys, so they actually did have colored vinyl way back in the day. But before that, you had the cardboard and the tin foil, and those just didn't work very well. But yes, most of them were portable to take around. They weren't really commercialized yet at that point, and not everybody had one.
So the gramophone, as that came into practice, was the gramophone still using those little cylinders like you're showing, or is the gramophone what basically is turned into the albums, the records that we know, the flat discs?
So the gramophone is what really plays those flat discs. And Emil Berlinger not only patented the first gramophone in 1887, but he actually invented the 78 shellac disc. So in 1890, the shellac disc came out. And this is basically a disc that has a very coarse groove. It's very heavy, very thick, very breakable. These things will shatter if you drop them. And they're made out of shellac and like a tree wax. So they're not vinyl polychloride like we see now on records. And these hold about 5 minutes of music per side. And that is really a big upgrade from this little cylindrical thing that would only hold about one song. So now you're able to put 5 minutes of music per side, a total of 10 minutes worth of music onto this little 10-inch discs. And these are also called 10 inches, so 78 shellac discs, or 10 inches. And it was a really big deal and very, very important to help the gramophone along.
Can you show the thickness of that again?
I sure can. These are very thick. Let me put a piece of paper up here so you can kind of get the idea of how thick it is.
And was that just a function of etching the groove into it that it just needed to be that thick, or why is it as thicker than what we came to know?
You know, I'm not entirely sure on that. I mean, obviously, when you're talking early records, you're talking with really a new technology that hadn't been released to the world. So a lot of people were using different materials, like you see the cardboard and the aluminum foil, as just a way to try to find something that they could put grooves into that would hold information to play back sound. So I'm not entirely sure why exactly that they used that material, but it did work, and it was a really big invention at its time.
And this may be a really stupid question, but from the very beginning, were they always double-sided? Or was there such a time where they really just had a flat disc and they etched only the one side?
As far as I know, all 78s were double-sided. Now, when you get into the gold mold records, which obviously is the first example of vinyl, it's just one song on a cylindrical tube. So you don't see more than that. And these aren't two-sided, obviously, because they go onto the machine and the needle reads it this way as it rotates back and forth. So you don't really flip these over like you do a 78 and get that second song.
So we have a note from Four Sandys. Is a gramophone the one with the big horn shaped like a big morning glory?
Yes, Sandy, that is the gramophone. It's got the big horn, the one speaker there on the big horn, and then it's a big solid piece of furniture on the bottom. Some of them had an extra cabinet underneath where you could store records, and then some of them just were kind of cut off. So you have a big thick box with the big wide mouth at the top.
Now I want to cover some of, definitely get into the more contemporary, because I think that's what most of us are familiar with and what we may see on a more regular basis. But I see those little Edison canisters fairly often. And at this point, because there was actually a question, and now of course I lost the chat, I can't remember who asked it, but I've never seen a player available for those cylinders, but I see the cylinders all the time. So at this point, are the cylinders just collected for their kind of coolness factor because they're antique and they're 120 years old, or are they, is that kind of an area of collectability? Are there such thing as the Edison cylinder style players?
So there are players available. They are very rare and very costly. You see the gramophones available, and if they're working, they are very good. I mean, to have, if they're working and you can get them, they're a nice little piece of equipment to have, but they are expensive, just like those early Edison players. And you do see these in the players and the cylindrical records in like museums now. I don't know what the going rate for them is, but most of the time people collect these simply as displays in their house, or just to have a really neat piece of record history.
Okay. So then as we move through the shellac era, how long did that last? How long did the gramophone slash shellac slash that huge cone tube or cone, speaker, how long did those stick around?
So shellac discs were around until 1948, when you have the invention of 33 1/3 records, or the long playing vinyl. But before that, there actually is another disc that came out that was invented by Edison. It was only around from 1912 to 1929, and this is an early diamond disc. It is very thick. It's 1/4 of an inch thick, and it spins at 80 RPM. You do need a special player for this. You have to have a diamond player. They're very rare, and if you find one of these early records, they are worth quite a bit of money. So you want to keep an eye out for these early diamond discs. But the shellac discs were around. Of course, they still have 78s within antique stores and that kind of thing, but they were around until the invention of the 33 1/3. Now, 33 1/3 was actually used in the 1920s. That speed was used in the talkies because they needed a way to play sound effects through an entire movie without having to keep changing the 78s, which were a problem because they only held 5 minutes of music or so per side. So they found a machine that could actually play at 33 1/3 RPM, which would allow the sound effects to play through the entire movie. Now, in 1930, RCA did invent the 33 1/3 long playing vinyl, and they tried to market it. But of course, that was the height of the Great Depression, and nobody wanted to spend money on new records and new equipment. You really couldn't do that. So it was an utter flop. But in 1948, Columbia Records was finally successful and invented the long playing vinyl. And what was special about it is they created the micro groove. And the micro groove allowed you to squeeze now all this music onto one vinyl record. So this is a Columbia 33 1/3 record from 1940. And this record does not have music on it. It's actually a neat time capsule of history. This is a Coca-Cola record, and it is the vice president talking about what they would do during the war and how they would transfer their plants from making not just Coke, but other things for the war effort. And on this record, he talks about how every GI will get a Coke no matter where in the world he is. But this is very cool. So this is a 33 1/3 RPM. The reason they're called that is because they spin round at 33 1/3 RPM, just like the 78s. They spin round at 78 revolutions per minute.
A really quick interruption. When you held that disc up, it looked like there was an outer ring that the grooves were slightly different than the kind of the bigger chunk in the middle from the center label. So what's the difference of how that was recorded?
So this is a 33 and a third, but it's not your typical 33 and a third record. It has less on it than regular vinyl, but this area here is where the music is. You can see the grooves. And then this big part right here is what we would call the dead wax. It's the space in between the last groove and the label there. And this one is just unique because it is a mainly talking record of Coca-Cola. It's not a listening record that you would hear music on.
All right, dead wax, a new term I get to carry with me. You had mentioned through the development, you had talked about the theater and talkies. So, just really quick, because this obviously isn't something we're going to run into in most vintage malls. Although mid-century wasted there in California, maybe they find something in Hollywood. But what were the talkies being recorded onto or into and played back from? Was that the same type of technology, or was that just like a totally separate thing specifically for movies?
I think the movies has their own technology, but as far as the sound effects go, they use 78 shellac discs for a very long time in the talkies, and they realized that just clearly wasn't working because you had to have an operator there to continue to do that. And I'm sure it wasn't very smooth. It didn't flow very well. So they ended up getting something that would just last the duration of the movie, because I believe that the movies were recorded separately and then you have the sound added later.
All right, so we've got through the war. You said shellac ended basically in 48. So now that we're in the 33 and a third, at what point did that start? I mean, what I kind of grew up on knowing a lot or having a lot of was the 45s. So what started changing in albums that the 45s kind of even became a thing?
So 45s have a really interesting history because, as I mentioned, RCA actually did invent, they were the first to invent and market the 33 and a third long playing vinyl, or LP, as we all know. But Columbia was the first person that was successful at it, the first company, rather, to be successful at marketing it. And in 1948, they, of course, created the 33 and a third, which held about 25 minutes of music per side, and was flexible and lightweight and wasn't going to break like the shellac disc. So RCA decided, well, that's all great, and we're kind of mad at them because they kind of took our idea and stole our thunder. So let's create something that would really leave our lasting mark on history, record history. So they came up with the 45 a year later in 1949. And when they came out, they wanted to make the 45s colored to celebrate the whole idea of 45. So here's a 45. These hold about 2 minutes or so of music per side. They're also known as 7-inch singles. Now, a 33 and a 45, you guys can play these on your turntable with no problem. It's the 78s that you need a special stylus and a player that plays 78s. But these will play regularly. Of course, you do need the 45 adapter so that it sits on the turntable and spins round. But RCA decided to use colors to celebrate their invention. So each of the colors actually stands for a genre of music. This that I'm holding here is green, and that represents country, but there was also red, that was jazz, and then you have yellow and blue and clear and all kinds of fun colors. But they also made, that same year that 45s came out, a 45 changer. And basically it was a record player for 45s, but you could stack a bunch of them on it and it would automatically play through the 45s. And what I find that's really interesting in those old advertisements for those players is that they specifically say it will play as much music as an LP. So they're really trying to sell people on this idea that you can get a 45 and kind of topple over Columbia's big invention that set the industry standard for records.
So you mentioned the 33 and a third could hold 25 minutes per side. What did the 7-inch 45s, I know they were singles, but was there a limit of how much timeline, how much time it could hold?
Well, because these are small, you can only fit about 2 minutes of music or so per side. You can't fit more because there's not enough space for it.
Now, I don't want to get too far into the music industry, but I will tell you, as I said earlier, we did not discuss what we were going to cover, and I'm right now totally fascinated because I did not realize 45s were this old. So I'm really kind of curious as basically 33 and a third and 45s started competing with each other, particularly once you got into that multi 45 player, which, in the 70s, we had one of those that did the multi. What was being recorded onto these, as we move, Blake mentioned something, or somebody mentioned something with the Beatles, as we get used to the idea of music groups creating an album. What if in 1949, what was going on 45s, and even really in 1948, what was going on 33 and a thirds? You had the vice president. At what point did the music industry that we all kind of know and think about now, I always thought 45s were way later and they were just a way to promote an individual song off of an album. Obviously I would say Columbia won, but what was the theory in 48, 49? Who were they trying to grab, and what kind of music were they trying to get out there?
So all kinds of music was put on 33 and a thirds and 45s. Now, in 1948, you have different music. You might have jazz. You might have early country, because in the 50s, you really start to see that early rock and roll. You've got blues influence and country influence there and that early rock and roll stuff. So in through the 50s, and of course, in the 60s, you see a lot of 50s vocal groups, doo-wop groups, early rock and roll, think Fats Domino, Chuck Berry. Of course, some of that was on 70, because it did probably take people a while to convert over from that format. But you do see a lot of that. And there are a lot of very rare doo-wop 45s from the early 50s that people are still really interested in collecting and can go for a lot of money. I was just in one of my record chats, Johnny G's Vinyl Treasure Show. I was watching his show, and it's all rare 50s stuff. And one guy was talking about buying a 50s record for $8,000. So there is some money to be made in some of those really early discs. And the Sun label is a great label for 45s. They had a lot of really early 45s that are just hard to get nowadays and can be quite very expensive, like Elvis and that sort of thing.
Now, you mentioned when the one that you showed that this was the RCA invention, you said that the color green was country and western, red was jazz, and then you went really fast and I couldn't write it down. At what point did the colors stop being a color thing? I saw colored ones again in the 70s. I think I had a Snoopy one that was maybe shaped like his doghouse that was red. But the colors were more of a novelty thing, not a genre thing. So when did was there a rock and roll color that, that Fats, all the people in the Sun Records that you talked about, or once Sun Records started doing their own thing, did they do their own colors, or at what point did they just become black?
So RCA was the only company that did the color records that were by genre that I know of. Now, I don't know how long that lasted. It was simply just really a novelty thing to get people to pay attention to the fact that they had invented 45. So it was sort of just celebrating the fact that they had invented this really cool new type of record. I don't know how long that lasted, but colored vinyl, actually, you had seen an example here from the 1900s. This is a blue amber record, and colored vinyl has been really around since then. In the 20s, you see 78s that are red and brown colored. And then in the 30s, you see a company making multicolored vinyl. But multicolored vinyl was expensive. So by the 1940s, you start to see around that wartime, you start to see it kind of slow down in production because it was expensive. Although Columbia Records actually made blue vinyl during the 1930s as a way to kind of pep people up during the Great Depression, because that was a very, very sad time and hard time in history. But color vinyl has continued through the years. We see color now in all kinds of crazy variants, splatter vinyl and smoke vinyl and translucent and all kinds of really fun stuff. So colored vinyl is still around. But to answer your question more specifically, Patrick, I don't know when RCA stopped the colors by genres. As far as I know, that was just an RCA kind of novelty thing. But there are other colors. And through the 50s, you tend to see way more black records than you do colored vinyl. And yes, Sun records were all black. It was typically RCA that just did the colored thing during that time.
So I guess one of the things that I'm somewhat fascinated by right now is, again, the concept of who, quote unquote, was making the records. Like you're saying, RCA was the one that colored it, but then Sun Records did all black. Is this a case where when a record company wanted to create an album, were they licensing the technology? Were they purchasing the raw material from somebody? Like, what would have dictated everything to go black versus still have that genre availability? Like, I guess RCA did record their own records. Was that just something they did for their own stable of artists, or was that something that they tried to stretch beyond their own groups?
I believe so. The way records work and labels work is that typically an artist is assigned to one record label. So for anybody that was in the catalog of RCA on that record label could come out on colored vinyl. Now, colored vinyl is a little bit more expensive to produce. So I really do believe that it's all up to the label and what they want to design and what they want to do and what the artist sees. And of course, that goes into now modern vinyl, where you have a lot more flashy colors and shapes and all kinds of different things coming out, where people are doing it to really kind of enhance the whole music experience. But colored vinyl back then was very, very expensive. And so it's probably something that you don't see tons of and people doing. Most records from that time period of 1948 through probably, I would say, around 1970, you see black. Not to say that there aren't colors, because obviously the RCA company did that, colored 45 specifically for their release of the 45 invention. But most of the time you do see black from that time period.
So if we look at the fact that, so we're basically in the 40s when the shellac went away, one of the things we didn't really talk about is, my understanding of the gramophone, that technology, that what that big cone was doing was it was just taking those vibrations and then passing it out, and that's what you heard it from. At some point, those cones went away, and so you got more, the stylus was what carried it, and you got speakers. At what point did you go from, just a mono recording to like the stereo recordings that we're used to? And how did that change with did stereo exist with 78s, or like at what point did that kick in?
So mono records were all the original formats. Mono has been around since the early records, and that's what all recordings were in. But stereo actually came out in 1958. That's when it was released to the world, and it changed everything, the way records were done. And of course, stereo is very different from mono. Mono records actually use only one channel. And you brought up a very good point, Patrick, that those old gramophones with that one horn or that one speaker is what you think of when you think of mono. It's one channel. It's coming through one speaker, all that sound, like a 1930s radio, for example, with just one speaker. But stereo, living stereo, allowed you to now hear things through two channels or two speakers. And that was a really, really big deal. I mean, you think about it, we kind of have stereo hearing. We have two ears, right? And we're hearing this sort of surround sound going on around us all the time. And stereo basically is that. It allowed you to hear a more 3D sound, something that allowed you to now place drums on one side and horns on this side and guitar on other sides. It's not all being shoved through one speaker or one channel. It now opens up your world to sort of this 3D sound. So this record here is actually a living stereo record from 1958 when stereo came out. And this is Sounds in Space, Living Stereo. And this would have been the equivalent of like going into Best Buy now and sitting down in the Bose speaker lounge and testing out surround sound. This was their way to introduce stereo to the world and show people why it was better and why they should get it, as opposed to mono. So this record here starts out in mono, and then it slowly starts to bring in stereo. And it uses a wonderful orchestra to illustrate their point, as well as even Julie Andrews is on this record. And you can hear the development of mono and stereo. Now, mono went away around 1970. That's when they started phasing it out. During this time period when stereo first came out, it was very, very unique, and a lot of people weren't ready to switch to it. They just didn't understand it. So you could get records either in mono or stereo. So a lot of companies at that time would produce records in mono and stereo, and this is a great example of that. Here is a Platters mono record, and this came out in 1966. But you can see that it says it's a mono record. Now, not all of them are marked mono, but this one is. But on the back, you see an advertisement here for its stereo buddy. So you could get mono, and here's the catalog number. And then here it is saying that you could get a long playing stereo. It says it's also available in stereo. So records came out in both for a long period of time so that people could either have either or, and they could kind of get used to stereo.
So during that time frame, you said from 1958 till basically 1970, where the two different were available, both mono and stereo. Because I don't understand the technology, and that's definitely not what we're going to cover today. What would happen if you played a mono record on a stereo system or a stereo record on a mono system? What would actually come out?
So that's a very interesting question. You can actually play mono records on a regular record player. You don't need anything special to hear it. It just won't sound the same as stereo. And it's kind of neat to take a mono record, play it, and then play a stereo record next to it and hear the differences. Now, there is something called a mono cartridge, and I don't want to get too technical with you all here on the deep dive because we're not really covering that. But the cartridge with the needle on it is the part that transmits the information from the record to your phono preamp and amplifier and speakers and all of that. But you can get a mono cartridge that plays mono, and a lot of vinyl people will say, oh, that's so much better. So yes, you can hear mono on your regular record player. There's no issue there. But if you really want to take a deep dive into mono, get a mono cartridge.
Excellent. So one of the things because we're already crossing out 3/4 of the hour, one of the things I know we definitely wanted to talk about is we were just now getting into like that rock and roll, that era. Again, if you do not subscribe to Katie's channel, you need to do so. And she plays different albums, different music, talks about records all the time. So you could definitely get more information. One of those. One of the things that I've heard you talk about is the impression of the album itself. So basically when it was made and then the number of impressions or things like that. Can we is this now the era, now that we're past the mono, we're into the 70s or maybe before? Can you talk a little bit about, the quality of the record and then the different impressions that you've talked about in the past?
Absolutely. So vinyl is not all created equal, and I am not an audio snob, so I'm not here preaching that, but I do think that all vinyl is created equal. And of course, it matters with the sound of vinyl. What a variety of factors really go into how the vinyl will sound. But first of all, records that have clicks and pops and have that kind of crackle is what we're all used to hearing. And we think of vinyl sounding like that, but it really shouldn't sound like that. It should be smooth and clean. Those clicks and pops in records are actually scratches, dirt, and debris and static from the record, which we don't want, because with vinyl, sound is everything. So you want to curate that sound until you get a really nice, beautiful, warm listening experience. It also matters how a vinyl sounds, not only its condition, but how it was mixed, how it was mastered. Sometimes the sound engineer maybe didn't do that good of a job and it may not sound great. Or someone puts digital audio onto vinyl, which in my opinion kind of defeats the purpose of having the vinyl, but digital is compressed music, so maybe that won't sound as good. So the records really are different, and you can find out what press you have of a record by looking up the matrix number, and that's going to help tell you whether it was a stereo or mono record, what press it is. And all of that matters when you're talking not only collectability, but sound. So as I mentioned, people are really after the best sound possible in vinyl. And obviously you want vinyl records to sound good. So you have to grade their condition and look at the overall condition of the record, but you also have to look at what press it is, because a lot of people want the true first press of an album. And that is basically the first press that was released from the pressing plant. Now, again, not to get too technical here, but the reason people want that is it's the closest to the original sound. It's the closest to the stamper. And the stamper is what actually presses down 60 tons of pressure onto that little disc of vinyl polychloride and makes a record. So people want to get closest to that because it sounds better. And a stamper will be typically able to press out 100,000 copies before it's done. So people want to get the original tapes from the recording studio and closest to that stamper. And that is why people like original vinyl. Now, not all original, again, can sound good because of the different factors on its condition, or maybe it wasn't mixed or mastered right. But that's a whole nother topic for a different day. But you really want to look at vinyl and you want to look at what press you have. So let me show you a great example of that. This is an original press record by Chuck Berry. It's the first true press of his Rocking at the Hops. This came out in 1960. And you want to look on the record to find out what press it is. Now, there's something that's called the matrix number, and this number is really, really important because that number tells you what press you have, what year it came out, and a whole variety of other things. Each pressing plant and label kind of has its own unique variety of numbers and letters that make up a matrix number that means something. But to the general public, most of us are reading it and it just looks like gibberish. And it's really hard to figure out how to read a matrix number. There are some people that said they have figured it out, but really the best way is to look for the matrix number on your record, which I'll show you here, and you can look it up online. There's a great website that all record collectors use and a lot of vinyl shops. It's called Discogs, and that will be on my Instagram page, and I'm sure Patrick can link it down below after this video goes live. But that is really, for a reseller or collector, the best way to look up the matrix number. It's sort of like an eBay and a Wikipedia for records, because you can buy records, but you can also look up the matrix number online. So the matrix number can be found on a record. It's very, very small in the dead wax of a record. So this is the inner groove here, and then you have your label. And then you have this little part of the record, which is empty, and this is your dead wax. In the inside, there's an inscription. There's several inscriptions, but you will find a long number. And this one here is where the matrix is. And I don't know, guys, if that's going to show up on camera at all. It's something you really got to take a magnifying glass to. But really look in the dead wax of your record to find out what press it is. Is it a first press, the first true press that came out on vinyl? Or is it a re-release, a reissue, or a repress? And those terms can get really confusing. But let me show you an example here. This is an example of a reissue of a vinyl record from the early 50s. This came out in probably 1990, but this is the Cool Penguins. The original is very expensive and very hard to find. But so this is a great record to have because I can't get the original. So now I've got something that has been reissued and it has all of the same music on it. Now, reissue, repress, and all of that can be kind of categorized as the same thing. But a lot of record collectors might say that it's different. And I've always called it the same thing. And this is kind of interesting. I was watching a YouTube channel the other day and they started talking about records and they said, oh, this is a great reissue. Oh, no, it's a repress. And I thought, there's a difference? I mean, it literally just stopped me in my tracks. I was like, I've been calling all of this the same thing. So in preparation for this deep dive, I actually called 18 record stores and got everybody's individual opinion on what they thought all those terms mean. And the overwhelming consensus was that they all were essentially the same thing. Some people said a repress is closest to the original pressing. It might have been that they made, so many copies, the stamper wore out, and then they produced some more. Or maybe it's, just basically closest to the original sound. And then reissue and all of that would have come out years later. So something that, was like that 50s album, and now they're reissuing it again onto vinyl. But really just know that it's not an original.
Two questions that are related to that. One would be, so that like the Penguins one that you just showed, so that was clearly, whatever term it was clearly a reissue, whatever. Would the matrix number still be sequential from the original 50s? So you're still talking about an impression, multiple times over, or because it's the first re-release, would it be the first matrix number?
So it will be a totally different matrix number. Each record has its own matrix number. And of course, when you're talking first presses, they will all have a specific matrix number. But this is its own totally different matrix number because it did come out years later from the original. Now, you do have to be careful, guys, of bootlegs. There are bootleg records out there, which are basically record fakes. The artist doesn't know that they are existing, and they don't have the permission from the artist. Sometimes it's material that hasn't been released before on vinyl, and other times it's stuff that's already been released, and it might look exactly the same as an original record. So you've got to be careful of these bootlegs that are out there, and that's where the matrix numbers are really going to help you, as well as other details. This is a great example of a bootleg, a Jamaican bootleg of Book of Love by the Monotones. This song came out in the 50s, and this is a great record, but it is a bootleg. First of all, you can easily see that this label's crudely put on. It's crooked on this side, and the spelling's kind of funky and all of that kind of stuff, and it's overly shiny. But by looking up the matrix number, I was able to determine that this really never was an original record. So that kind of stuff will help you. And it does help you when you're valuing records, when you're putting a price on records, whether you're wanting to buy a record and you're like, oh, that's expensive. It gives you a reason why, that maybe that's an original and maybe it's a little bit more rare. Or if you're putting a price on a record, say you're a reseller and you found this great vinyl at a crate at the Goodwill, you can look up the matrix number and find out what it is, and then use the Discogs marketplace to really see what the going value of records are. Every value is different, and it really does depend on the condition of the record and what the record is, whether it's a repress or an original or that sort of thing. You really want to use the record grading system to determine if a record has any value, what value it is, and that kind of thing. So here's the grading system. So we've got mint, near mint, mint minus, very good minus, good, poor, and fair. And this is what everybody uses within the vinyl community to do record grading. So you'll see this for grading the album jackets as well as the album. And when you're buying a record and you look online, really look for the grade of it so you know what condition it's in. Obviously, mint is the best, but I will buy records that are very good plus. When you start to get into good and poor and all of that, you really get a lot of scratches and gouges. And when you get down to poor and fair, there's going to be warps. There's going to be a lot of issues with the record. So you really want to look for the record grading system.
So related to the grading system, so we're not going to, Mark had a question about the quality of the sound. I think you kind of touched on that a little bit, but as we get into the later pressings, as we talk about values, if you have a matrix number that shows that this is, 5th, 10th pressing, but it's in say that's in mint condition, is there still a value? Is there such a thing as a valuable late reissue or later reprint, or is really the money and the collectibility just in those initial presses?
Absolutely. There actually is value in some second pressings and later pressings. I've heard a couple of people say that they listen to the original press of something and then they have something that's a second press and they actually think it sounds better. With vinyl, really for you, you have to hear it to determine what you think sounds good, because to me, sound is very subjective. Obviously, if you see records that are scratched up, there's going to be static and surface noise, which is really the enemy of vinyl, and you don't want that. But sound, as far as the other sound goes, it does depend on your system and what sounds good to you. And so there is some value in some of those second presses, and it really does depend, though, on whether the record is mass produced or it's rare. Because, take an Andy Williams album, for example, they're a dime a dozen, and I see them all the time in the dollar bin because they just don't sell. I mean, I love Andy Williams, and so I always get a good deal from those records in the dollar bin. But just because you have a first press Andy Williams album doesn't mean it may be worth a lot. Because it's mass produced. So you kind of have to go case by case and just look up your vinyl online and find that information out.
Can you talk at all about we're very quickly running out of time, but we've got a lot of good questions coming in. Can you talk at all about the collectability of just the jacket art? If we get to a point, I very rarely would know what a rated album was because I typically am seeing them at a Goodwill or thrift store and estate sale. But they could have some great jacket art. Is there collectability just for the art? Or, is there such a thing as an album that's collected that is ugly art or jacket art that's collected that's bad music?
Well, absolutely. People love how vinyl is nowadays because there's so much that you can really get with vinyl. And you can even get shaped records nowadays. And this one's a Elvis Presley Christmas tree shaped vinyl here, which is really fun. But yes, the album art is collectible because people like to frame them and do all kinds of fun things with them. So if you have a record that maybe is in poor shape, but you have a really good album jacket, you can sell the album jacket and somebody might want to frame it or do some sort of art with it. This is a great example. This is Queen Jazz. This is the original, and it comes with a poster inside. So you could have this framed and then put the poster next to it. Now, I can't show you the poster here on YouTube because the women are nude, but it's a great album art. You also have things like this. This is a Chubby Checker biggest hits record, and the front's really cool, but you also have these pull-off pictures on the back, which would really make a great display. So there's a lot of collectability on the album art. And when you're talking vinyl where it's a limited release, like a band does maybe only 200 worldwide or 200 US or something like that, and they really put in a lot of detail into their packaging where you're getting maybe a poster or booklets and you're getting really awesome album art, people really are seeking that, not only because the record itself was so limited, but also because the album art's just really cool.
One of the questions came in from Sandy for Sandy's Lilacs. You're kind of talking about both sides of the collectability. What either is your holy grail of records, or is there a certain type of holy grail that the industry is looking out for?
Well, there's lots of vinyl that is out there that people are collecting and it really considers their holy grail. Everyone collects a different genre of music, or maybe they collect many, but that is the beauty of vinyl and music, is you can pick a specific era or a specific genre that you really want and get into that. For me, I love 50s and 60s music. I love that doo-wop sound, and I have always been after that wonderful Marvelettes group. They made a record called Please Mr. Postman, and I don't know why I can't find it, but the last listing sold for $600 on eBay, and that is definitely, to me, if I found that, that would be like my holy grail of records. Or Chuck Berry's, I think it's the one with the berries on the front. Is it called 16 Berries or something like that? But I don't have that Chuck Berry, and I have quite a few Chuck Berries, and I really like to get that.
That sounds great. We're pretty much at the top of the hour. So I know one of the questions I was going to push over to you, I want to say Blake and a couple other people answered. It was how to, Michelle Ann was asking how the best way to clean records. So Katie can look in the chat. If there's anything she wants to add on that later, she can answer that. But the one question that did not get answered in the chat and we didn't really cover, and I think it's just a good one to wrap up, Dana from Grace 2010H asked just your recommendation or thoughts on quality player if somebody was looking to build up a collection or to utilize a collection they have that would not be super expensive. What is the best way to pick what it would be a recommended player to pick up for personal use that wouldn't cost a fortune?
So I have a Fluence RT82 turntable, and I really love the Fluence brand because they add a lot of features that you see on high-end turntables, but you're getting it for a lot less money. I am not saying anything bad about suitcase players. They really do help the vinyl industry kind of revitalize, and they do a lot for local record stores. But those players are not going to have good sound quality, especially when you have built-in speakers. I know they're cheap and they're out there and they're easy to go pick up at the local store, but I really recommend spending a few more bucks and get something around $100 or so. And Fluence makes a wide range of turntables. So mine is about $250, but if you wanted to get their $100 version, you can. And it's a really, really good player with a lot of features packed into it, and it will help you grow with vinyl. Just pick a player that will help you grow. So if you want to get more into the hobby, you can change the stylus, or you can do all different things to really help curate your sound. I'd stay away from the players that have the suitcase style with the built-in speakers.
Well, thank you very much. We are not sponsored by any of those individuals, but they want to send us a free one. But Katie can get me some links or give me those names. I'll put those into the notes for this video once it's posted. So I'll try and have a couple extra links or at least some of the names that she mentioned throughout the deep dive. So really appreciate Katie's time. Appreciate all of you for joining us this evening. I've heard, a lot of people are thanking me for doing the deep dives. I hope you guys are enjoying them. This is what I get into, and this is what I enjoy about the vintage world, is just learning more about it. And it's fun for me to pick topics that I hope will be interesting to everyone. But to be perfectly honest, sometimes they're just topics I need to learn about. And this was definitely one of them. And Katie was definitely my person that I went to ask me how to teach me. Blake, sorry. I might have asked you if I knew you, but too bad. Katie did a great job. Appreciate Katie. And again, appreciate all of you. Thank you for giving me your time. And thanks for putting your trust in Trusty Huckster. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thank you for tuning in.
Bye-bye.